And welcome to everybody. We have the honor of having Holly Easton, who is at two different sort of places, both ECCC and also the University of Toronto Scarborough. And as is my want for these seminars or webinars with the Center for Applied Sciences in Ontario Protected Areas, Casiopa, I'm not going to do most of the talking because you don't want to hear from me. You want to hear from Holly is what you want to hear from. So Holly's going to talk about OECMs. And without further ado, I'm going to turn over to her. You'll see me disappear and mute myself. Holly, obviously, if there's anything you need to do for me, it's a webinar, you're amongst friends. Don't hesitate to sort of say, Murph, do something, and we'll go from there. But I'll turn right over to you, my friend.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, everyone, for coming or watching this at a later date. My name is Holly Easton, and before I start, I'm just going to have a brief land acknowledgement. So I want to start by honoring the land from which I'm giving this presentation. It has been the site of human activity since time immemorial and is the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee and the Métis, and the Mississauga of the Credit River First Nations. First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people of Turtle Island are the original stewards and memory keepers of this land, which is incredibly important to our topic today. And where I'm situated is right between the eastern and western branches of the Carrying Place Trail, a network of trade routes with over 12,000 years of history. Lake Ontario and Toronto have for a very long time been influential, have had a long and influential history as an area of trade, transportation, connection, and food. And as a settler, I am immensely grateful for the opportunity to live, work, and create here. And I would also like to acknowledge, as this is a webinar and it would not be possible without the use of our electronics, the reality of and exploitation of workers, many of whom are children, that are compelled to extract the minerals omnipresent but often forgotten in our devices. And to note that these unethical systems that underlie the manufacturing, transportation, and disposal of these devices serve only to further the harms of extraction, displacement, and environmental damage that we are going to be talking about today. So to start our presentation, again, thank you for attending. My work, which is looking at OECMs and how academic institutions can contribute to the Global Biodiversity Framework, Target 3, and Canada's 30 by 30 commitment, is done with the support of the Protected and Conserved Area Recognition Unit at Environment and Climate Change Canada, or ECCC. I recently completed my master's research on this topic, and I aim to answer how or if academic institutions like universities, colleges, and field stations can advance some of Canada's broader conservation targets, like our Target 3 initiative to conserve 30% of land and water by 2030. So just as an overview, when I mention Target 3, I'm referring to the 23 targets that make up the Global Biodiversity Framework, which was adopted by the UN Conference of the Parties on the Convention of Biological Diversity in 2022, so that's COP15, with the aim to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. So Target 3 aims to conserve 30% of land and waters and seas by 2030, and Canada, along with a number of other nations, committed to achieving this target, and that would be our 30 by 30 target. So broadly, my research was trying to answer the following questions. One, what can academic lands contribute to the Global Biodiversity Framework? And do they want to? Are they interested? Pretty important component. So this work was inspired by Queen's University's Biological Research Station, CUBES, which in 2020 received national recognition as an OECM, or an other effective area-based conservation measure. So OECMs are a relatively new form of conserved area that aim to recognize land that's been effectively managed and provide positive biodiversity outcomes. But within OECMs, their primary objective might not be biodiversity conservation. So within an academic context, this might include ranches, research ranches, campus set-asides for conservation, or research stations like at Queen's, which represent pretty intact ecosystems, but they exist primarily for education and academic research. So the distinction there is that idea of their primary goal isn't inherently conservation. But what I really want you to take away is that OECMs are meant to be inclusive of different ways of stewarding the land. So the idea that conservation is more than just a formal protected area. Um, OECMs really emphasize outcomes over, say, an area-based target. So we're looking to provide area. So we're looking to recognize areas that already provide biodiversity benefits, and we're just looking to recognize and sustain those benefits. Um, OECMs were conceived to coexist with protected areas, but their approach provides an opportunity for conservation gains in areas of critical value. So this could be under or unprotected key biodiversity areas, or areas in high threat regions, which might include urban areas where a lot of campuses reside. So despite being an important conservation tool, currently, OECMs represent less than 1% of Canada's protected and conserved areas. So there are a few reasons for this. Partly, this is because they're new. For context, although they were proposed in 2010, so almost 15 years ago, they actually weren't defined until 2018. So we're looking at less than a decade of implementation. But in addition to that, there are no clear incentives like tax breaks for receiving OECM recognition currently. And when you dig into the literature on OECMs, you'll find that it's a bit sparse. A literature in 2023 found that there were only about 105 papers that mentioned OECMs, and most of those just mentioned them. They were just a reference that they exist. And in actuality, there was about 26 papers that were actually about OECMs. But that was 18 months ago. So we've probably cracked 30 by now, but still, we're not looking at all that much literature. So in the last year, I started doing research. I started my research by doing outreach to over 170 different English-speaking academic institutions across the country. I spoke to a number of academics, research chairs, administrative departments like sustainability departments or facility teams, and I presented them with the concept of OECMs, asked if they had any land that they thought might be eligible to be assessed as an OECM, and then I would assess the land and report my findings back to them. And the land assessment afterwards, I would provide the support to the school should they want to voluntarily recognize their land as an OECM. So the OECM assessment is done using the Pan-Canadian Decision Support Tool, or the DST, which was created to evaluate an area's viability as a protected area or as a potential OECM. So the tool was developed to create consistency across assessments, even when we're looking at really different contexts and diverse landscapes. So they did this. I won't go too into detail about this, but they divided the decision support tool into 9 different criteria, each of which has an intended effect. So think of this as an overarching goal on which is being considered when we're evaluating this. So some of these things include geographical space, and we're looking at questions like, is it mappable? Do people know where the boundaries are? Long term, will this land be conserved well into the future? And the biodiversity outcomes, what are they, and how are they being managed to effectively sustain them? So academic institutions have a really hectic schedule. There's a very short turnaround and semesters, and there's a lot of different priorities. But through my outreach, I received responses from 31 institutions, which is a hit rate of about 18%, which I thought was pretty good. But I admit it's a bit low. What I found, though, in my meetings with the people who did respond is that there was a great deal of enthusiasm for OECMs and the project itself. Initial discussions resulted in over 1,300 hectares of potential OECMs across Ontario, and discussions for over 30,000 hectares of potential OECMs across the country. So quickly, I want to answer, what does recognition look like in practice? So once an area has been assessed as eligible to receive OECM recognition, and all ownership parties have consented to this recognition, the area will become part of the CPCAT, the Canadian Protected and Conserved Area Database. The land remains under the same ownership, but the point of contact will receive an annual email from ECCC checking in on their commitment and asking if there have been any changes to things like their contact information or ownership on the landholder's end. So it's a pretty low once the recognition has been received, it's pretty low maintenance to actually sustain. So when I started my research, my initial question was, how can academic institutions contribute to those pan-Canadian national conservation targets? But over the process of my research, what I realized was that OECM recognition was actually a really helpful tool for these institutions to achieve their own sustainability goals. It turns out Canadian universities take sustainability incredibly seriously. In part, this is because sustainability is considered to be a driving factor in student recruitment, but also many of these institutions have signed on to commitments to track their environmental initiatives already, and they're interested in tracking their implementation of their sustainable development goals. And so there's a lot of participation in groups such as STARS, which stands for the Sustainable Tracking Assessment and Rating System, or the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, to monitor and report on their progress towards their social and environmental sustainability goals. So what's really exciting about this research and OECMs as a potential path for these schools to embolden some of their environmental targets is that when I mentioned a few slides ago that there's no real incentive for OECM's recognition yet, what I found through this research is that, at least indirectly, I had stumbled on an internal incentive within these institutions that motivated them to collaborate towards these National Target 3 initiatives. Which, at least for professionals working in the OECM space, is a really valuable insight on how to build partnerships for future OECM recognition, and more broadly, how to build partnerships for other conservation initiatives. So academic institutions, as I'm sure we all know, are really meaningful community spaces for students, staff, faculty, and the municipalities surrounding them. So academic OECM recognition presents an opportunity to strengthen these bonds and build on climate and ecological resilience. We know from research that students' engagement in sustainability initiatives often increases a school's green or environmental reputation. Having access to green space increases not only the mental health of students, but also their sense of community within the school. And in addition, OECM recognition provides an opportunity for student groups, individuals, and the greater academic community to address the "what can I do" questions that loom over so many environmental challenges. And again, it supports many of those sustainable development goals, which build towards just a more equitable and resilient future. So what I want to return to is this idea that OECMs are designed to be inclusive. And I feel that partnership with academic institutions are really well positioned to increase inclusion in conservation. For institutions that are committed to community and student engagement in their conservation initiatives, receiving OECM recognition can be a point of pride. And it can provide students with really significant opportunities for meaningful and practical classroom research and stewardship experience in conservation. So I started out this presentation by saying that OECMs are meant to measure outcomes instead of area-based targets. But the very premise of this research is based on hectares and an area-based 30 by 30 goal. So what I think is neat about these partnerships with academic institutions is that there's an opportunity here for Canadian university and colleges to really define what makes an effective and successful OECM. These institutions have the potential to address some of the questions of ecological monitoring or outstanding issues such as the deficit of literature that plague not just OECMs, but protected areas kind of generally. And they also have an opportunity to report on how OECMs support not just their environmental targets, but also their social targets. And they have this opportunity to make the recognition process highly collaborative with their students and communities, which only goes to further support that long-term goal of OECMs representing different ways to steward the land. So given that this tool is still so new, particularly within the academic context, Queen's Biological Research Station is actually the only academic OECM in the world right now. Early adopters, like what could be academic institutions in Canada, really have that potential to define how we measure and value an OECM, not just in Canada, but we actually have this opportunity to make it a truly international make a truly international mark on what it means to have a sustainable university in the world. So this tool is, as it becomes more prevalent, I think it could be a really powerful opportunity to impact the future of conservation and climate action, both from the standpoint of these schools and institutions, and also from the standpoint of community building and inclusiveness. So back to my initial questions. Yes, academic lands have the potential to contribute to Target 3. Canadian colleges and universities have already been recognized internationally for their sustainability leadership. And I feel that OECM recognition presents an opportunity not only to grow the prestige of that reputation, but also to make strides to actively reflect the different ways of stewarding nature, and to build partnerships that recognize and celebrate conservation. So land use change has been identified as the most damaging force on terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems over the last 50 years. And OECM recognitions provide an opportunity for some of the most significant scientific research organizations in our country to actively contribute to local, national, and international targets that aim to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. So I just want to close out saying that there are a number of helpful resources available on canadaconservation.ca, including the decision support tool if you wanted to, look into whether or not an area at your institution might be eligible for OECM recognition. But there are also several stories and examples of other OECMs across Canada there available for more information. And I just wanted to thank you all for listening to me. And I hope that we can really grow the impact of OECMs across this country. Thank you.
And thank you. That was a master class on how to present this information, Holly. So have you still got to defend your work at UT?
No, I defended in September.
You did finish in December. That's what I thought. I thought you actually, that was we were implying. Actually, I just wanted to make sure that I didn't wrong. If it did, it's like, man, you could just like do this again and again. Actually, it's fantastic. We really appreciate you actually going through it. I'm going to turn it over to our two colleagues actually here on there. To ask anything that you would like. And if not, I have things that I can discuss too. Holly, without, of course, this is not going to be combative. I think your stuff raised a whole pile of really great questions in a really positive direction. So, Cashin, you're welcome to sort of chime in as well. People can unmute themselves and ask questions. As always, we have, of course, a standard code of conduct, no being an idiot. But other than that, we're all good. If not, I will ask the first question, but I'll give you guys a chance to see if you want to ask anything too. Holly, you can ask yourself a question as well. Oh, okay. Cash has just mentioned there's no questions yet. They're going, no problem. Stephanie, did you want to ask something?
Yes. Holly, first, thank you for the presentation. I enjoy getting to know more about the OECMs. And actually, in my own work, I'm starting to think about OECMs. I look at the impacts of urban parks, especially the parks that are designed for joint benefits to people and nature. So parks that include that biodiversity conservation goal there. And so I've been wondering whether they can make some of those OECMs in the future, right? And so I wanted to ask specifically about this long-term criterion. If you could just share a little bit more details about how that is assessed and what would this yearly checking touch on if it does, right? Like, how do we keep looking at the long-term aspect of it?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It is an incredibly relevant one. So I'll say my research, I reached out to schools across the country, and the question of long term is actually, it changes a little bit depending on what jurisdiction you're in. So Nova Scotia, Ontario, BC, there's all slightly different interpretations as to what that means, which can make this work a little bit tricky. Because we're talking about Ontario at Casiopa today, so I'll focus on Ontario. Our goal is, of course, we're trying to protect 30% of land by 2030. So as a private landholder, in the case of an academic institution, the reality is that if they own the land fee simple, they can put it in and remove it to CPCAD as they would like. There's nothing really we can do about it. It's their land and they maintain ownership. The intention with this recognition is, of course, to contribute to biodiversity protection long term, and that means sort of in perpetuity. So the intention is often to, one, first of all, if we're trying to hit 30 by 30, at least till 2030, but certainly we're looking for something that has a longer tenure. So 25 years, 50 years, 100 years is what we're hoping to achieve. And there's some variation just depending on who is going to accept what as the to actually count. But my intention is always, there is no known goal to remove this from CPCAD. We're going to put this in and leave it in. And hopefully there won't be a scenario where suddenly the school dissolves and we need to sell everything. So within some of the municipalities that have received OECM recognition for their areas, their commitment is a long-term commitment, but what we stack when we put something into CPCAD is what we call effective means. And these are the mechanisms that protect the area. So if we're looking at some of those areas that have maybe been plugged into the database by Brampton or Guelph this year, we're looking at areas that are maybe zoned as floodplains or have certain zoning restrictions already imposed on them. They're protected by their conservation authority. And so any kind of development would be prohibitive without extensive lobbying to rezone it or dissolve the conservation authority or the conservation easement, which helps maintain that long-term element of an area. And when we're trying to secure long-term for an area that might not be as easily protected as it is with zoning, we might look for a conservation easement agreement between the landholder and the government. And yes, so there's a few different mechanisms, but basically the long and short there from my rambling is long-term has some variability depending on where you are. Our intention is always to be biodiversity focused first, and we want this to be positive outcome and not just something that we're going back and forth on. But for OECM recognition to actually pass, we have several layers of effective means that are adding protection that make it more likely that it will stay in CPCAD long term. And to your question of urban parks, because I'm a big urban parks person, they might qualify, depends on the park. We try to avoid areas that are maybe like mowed grass and predominantly say a big ultimate frisbee pitch or something like that. But you have areas that are more natural, heavily forested. Those might qualify, and it's worth the municipalities or the community groups really looking into it.
Yeah, thank you for those details, because as you were mentioning the flood zones, I can think of parks that, so I look at ecological parks. That's the focus. And so a lot of ecological parks are rescuing these areas, naturalizing those river the riverbanks, for example, and they're looking to provide that flood protection, flood mitigation service while creating an area for recreation. And as soon as you said that, I thought, oh, like that could apply. Yeah. And also in the case of some of the parks, they are designed from the beginning, they're thinking of providing habitat, they're incorporating restoration into the whole project. So it's also it gives us the idea that maybe there's some of these projects could find that kind of conservation commitment, because from the beginning they're setting out to benefit biodiversity.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's very worthwhile to pursue.
Thank you.
Yes, that would make sense. I suspect you're kind of a little bit nervous about your sample size. You passed your defense, obviously, so I mean that would be, in there, right? I actually don't think it's a low sample size, primarily because the sample universe actually of people, of institutions interested in this would be fairly small. Like I can see my own University of Waterloo. I'm sitting out looking for a Laurel Creek. I mean, none of that would qualify as an OECM, and we have what's called an environmental reserve. But if it's an environmental reserve and I'm an MBA player, I mean, it's not really any of that. And that's probably true of most, like Queen's main campus, for example, where I went to school, would not, because there's just nothing there. I mean, it's an urban campus. I'm not complaining about it. It's just there wouldn't be anything there. Cubes would actually make a lot of sense because I worked there too, right? And it's like that makes sense. And so a lot of places I suspect you got responses from are likely to be ones that actually have something like UBS, or at least an extensive campus. UBC would come to mind, for example, on its main campus. It has a huge area that would actually qualify, but a lot of other places wouldn't. So I don't think your sample size is low at all. I think it's probably pretty much reflective of the actual universe.
Yeah, I mean, that was quite interesting, honestly, just talking to all the different schools about what they had
Yeah.
available. And what was really like a factor that unlocked a lot of success for me, and I had no idea, is that particularly Ontario colleges have huge amounts of land.
They
A
do.
lot of the northern colleges, and I just didn't know this because I haven't had the opportunity to be in the college system, and I was
Of
like,
course.
oh, there's a huge amount of land. They have a lot of field courses. And
Yes.
so some of these gains were like really significant. And the college system as well, I think maybe because some of the administration is smaller, their sustainability offices are a little bit more, in my experience, they seemed a little bit more developed and a little bit more progressed than a lot of the university sustainability offices.
Yep.
So I had a lot of really interesting meetings, but we assessed a college here in Ontario that they were looking at. It's not a ton of land. It's about 20 hectares in total
Okay.
of campus set asides that are just, they're in a floodplain. They can't develop them. But it connected. It's in a municipality that has plugged in a bunch of their land as an OECM.
Yeah.
And if this school consents to it, it'll actually connect two bits that are already in CPCAD, and it'll make a beautiful little
Interesting.
corridor there that I am really excited for.
Yeah, no, I can see that actually. We're about a minute away from the end here, so if there's any quick comments anybody wants to make, that's great. But I do want to be respectful of people's times. We don't want to capture more time than we've asked for. So, oh, thanks, Cashin. I really appreciate it. So, Holly, you've got praise from Cashin actually on the presentation. If you're looking at the chat or anything along those lines, I think it's got a lot of promise. And again, if you look at kind of the literature out there. One of the criticisms of OECMs is that, there's not a lot of inventorying, monitoring, quantitative analysis being done. But I look at the protected areas going, well, it's the same thing, protected areas. I mean, they haven't done a lot of that either, right? So it's kind of a strange criticism of Levy. I mean, I think it's fair, but it's like if you're going to do that, you should be applying it to their other actual protected areas too. So I appreciate sort of where that's going to go. It's all good.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you for doing it. And again, for those who attended today, thank you very much. It will get quite a few hits online. It always does, especially OECMs. There's a lot of people. So one of the things we can do jointly actually is you can alert people in your, especially since you actually do much more than I do, alert people who do OECMs and say, hey, we got another presentation on here, because we actually had one done by a now retired colleague actually from MNRF actually a couple of years ago. So we've actually got a couple of them up on the website, which is really nice. So without further ado, I will thank again everybody here, and Holly particularly, for coming in and doing this for us. I really appreciate it. Hope to sort of follow up at some point actually with some general chat, but I will let everybody know when this thing actually gets launched onto the website, probably about a day or two, not very long. So thank you.
Oh, amazing.
All right.
Yeah,
Without
thank
further
you.
ado, folks, thank you. I'm going to end out the meeting, and thanks everybody for attending. Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.